Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Hi, welcome to Neuroverse,
A podcast hosted by Clara
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on breathing, the brain, and being.
BBB, but not as you know it.
Not the blood-brain barrier. We're going to be discussing today breathing and how it interacts with activity in the brain, and specifically how breathing influences interoception, which is our awareness of the internal state of our body.
Very interesting.
This topic is particularly interesting to me because I'm really interested in traditional yoga practices, which includes a form of breathing exercises. And in yoga, they refer to this as pranayama. And what I find really interesting is the connection between breath and the mind and the state of mind and cognitive activity has always kind of been known and alluded to throughout human literature and tradition and spiritual practices. For example, in the case of pranayama, prana actually means breath and yama means control, but the word prana also means life force, which shows so well the connection between how much we rely on breath to keep us alive energetically. And then this reminded me of another thing. I came across this book I'm reading called Women Who Run with the Wolves.
Okay.
And the book is a bit unrelated, but I learned that in ancient Greek, the word psyche is linguistically related to pneuma, which is the word for lungs and breathing. So the psyche is actually connected to the breath in this language. And I just found that so interesting.
It is so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like how there's many different overlaps and perspectives of the breath and breathing and our own biology and the interaction with it.
Yeah, and only now is science starting to actually understand these things.
And research it.
Exactly. So I guess for some background, this topic is so vast because a lot is understood about the mechanisms of what controls breathing.
Yeah.
For example, the respiratory center in the brain is at the base of our brains in the brain stem in a region known as the medulla, where there are these pacemaker neurons that fire rhythmically, and this causes the cyclical rhythm of the breath because they influence the activity of the diaphragm and muscles around that area.
Yeah.
Not a doctor. But
this is not backed up by a medical education.
No, exactly.
Disclaimer.
Yeah. Our podcast is always going to be full of disclaimers. But
the autonomous and non-volitional aspect of breathing is known.
This is the main thing I wanted to explore. The fact that breathing is so unique in that it's the only autonomic function of the human body that can also be controlled consciously.
I was actually going to ask that. Okay.
Yeah. So autonomic functions are functions in the body, physiological functions that occur involuntarily, such as the heartbeat.
Okay.
Or digestion.
Okay.
And breathing.
And oxygenation of cells. We have no control over that.
Yes. Which breathing does play a role in.
Yes.
But it can also be consciously controlled, which
just opens up many doors.
So many possibilities of our own interaction with our own bodies.
Yeah.
It's all about the mind-brain interaction.
Oh my God, I love it.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask, so once we talk about this a bit more, I read that, for example, breathing, we can control it and it has ties with, for example, helping our anxiety and because we indirectly like slow down our heart rate through like these breathing exercises.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask if you think that there's any other interoceptive or like autonomous, sorry, aspects of our body or physiology or anything that you think we can have control over.
I don't think there is another autonomic function that we can
I was wondering,
control.
what about like this isn't an autonomic function, but this is the only other thing I can think of that we can kind of control, such as dreams. There's people that can
Yeah.
like they're dreaming and
Oh,
they're
lucid dreaming.
lucid dreaming, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's like not an autonomic physiological function though. That's cognitive.
Okay, fine.
Although I did come across a paper that showed that the rhythm of breathing, the respiratory rhythm, regulates brain-wide activity during sleep.
Okay.
And I'm trying to connect these two things in this moment.
Do it.
Oh my gosh, maybe breathing influences lucid dreaming. No, I mean, that was different. I don't think it's possible to connect these. But that was to do with how the respiratory rhythm is synchronized with both oscillatory neural activity in the cortex as well as the hippocampus, and it basically underlies the propagation of brain waves from the hippocampus to the cortex, and this is functionally implicated in the transfer of information from the hippocampus, which is the seat of memory, to the cortex, which is responsible for many higher cognitive functions. And so essentially this regulates memory consolidation during sleep.
Oh, nice.
And it's so interesting that like breathing can provide a scaffold for this.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the perfect word to describe it. A scaffold for it.
Yeah.
And I would never think that breathing would provide a scaffold for something like that. I would imagine maybe glucose or, I don't know,
Biochemistry.
Yeah. Other biochemical things that would actually contribute.
But breathing does probably... I mean, the whole thing about how the...
Is it to do with the
brain
oxygen
stem
levels?
Yeah, so I was going to say that the brain stem regulates the breathing rate based on chemoreceptors that measure the levels of carbon dioxide. So it always is going to be a biochemical mechanism.
Yeah.
And then obviously increasing your breathing rate alters your oxygen in your blood throughout your body, which includes the blood that goes to your brain. So it's just a different level of how things work.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing about breathing and it being a scaffold is like it's something that we never notice just because we as humans literally, it's the only thing that, well, okay, I guess it's not the only thing. There's a lot of stuff that happens
really
throughout
control.
our life, but yeah.
Yeah.
But then we have the option to control it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is what makes it ever the more interesting, and this tie with the higher cognitive function and like, a basic breathing process. Yes.
So I wanted to talk a bit about this. So a recent study in 2017 by a group at Stanford, they actually were trying to molecularly characterize the different populations of neurons in the brain stem that are responsible for breathing and see which different populations are responsible for different types of breathing.
Oh, wow.
But then something they found was completely almost unrelated to this, because they discovered a population of genetically defined neurons, and they knocked them out genetically, so they got rid of them to see how this would alter breathing function in mice. And actually the mice, their breathing wasn't affected, but they found that the mice were unusually calm.
Okay.
And they were really intrigued by this because there were just a bunch of like lazy mice lying around in the cages being really calm, which is unusual for very hyperactively normal mice.
Yeah. Or just normal behavior mouse. Fidgeting around and exploring.
Yeah. But they found that these brainstem neurons, they project to an area higher up in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus, that is the main center of neurons that release the neurotransmitter noradrenaline, which is responsible for arousal and attention and anxiety. And so by removing these neurons, the locus coeruleus wasn't being activated as much, and so it wasn't releasing as much noradrenaline, and so that was what resulted in the mice being calm. And so the noradrenaline basically gets emitted to higher brain regions like the cortex or the hippocampus, and this was like a perfect example to show that neurons in the brainstem respiratory center can actually directly affect higher cognitive functions like attention and arousal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting.
And there was actually a really good review written on this where they created the picture of a respiratory locus coeruleus attentional system, describing how the respiratory systems and attentional systems, one coming from the bottom up and one coming from the top down, can converge onto the locus coeruleus.
Okay.
And it's interesting how this works because it's not that intuitive. So they firstly outlined many studies that showed that locus coeruleus activity is synchronized with the respiratory rhythm. And the locus coeruleus neurons can exhibit tonic activity or phasic bursting, which is related to the attentional state. So a distracted state is associated with like a high level of tonic firing of neurons, whereas a focused state is associated with a phasic firing of neurons. And the fact that the respiratory rhythm is coupled with locus coeruleus activity, this way altering your respiration rate can change how focused or distracted you are.
Nice.
And they also outlined how consciously controlling this through breathing practices such as pranayama, which I mentioned, it basically enforces top-down control.
Yeah.
And it causes more... so they talked about this in the context of predictive coding, actually, which we talked about in a previous episode, and also just keep mentioning because it seems to infiltrate every topic related to neuroscience these days. But so practicing conscious control of your breathing over time causes a more precise prediction of bottom-up activity and locus coeruleus activity.
Yes.
And so you're like, yes.
Keep going.
Exactly, that's exactly the lucky game. And so over time, this essentially reduces the variability in locus coeruleus neuron firing. And in long-term practitioners, they suggested that this could stabilize attention, which is influenced by the locus coeruleus projections up to higher brain areas, right? And so even if there are environmental fluctuations in your breathing because you're stressed or whatever reasons you might be breathing faster, then the locus coeruleus neurons are less reactive to this change that's coming from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And so you're more likely to not have your attention be affected by these physiological changes. Nice. Isn't that so cool?
It is so cool. And yeah, I read something similar about the updating the top-down interoceptive predictions through breathing, and how controlling breathing is a way to anchor into the present, since this causes an update to the regulatory mechanisms of your interoceptive experience. Does that make sense? And then another thing, which I think you touched on, is the fact that this updates the interoceptive predictions. It causes an error minimizing process,
which is the goal of predictive coding. Yeah. Or maybe we should quickly outline predictive coding for anyone who hasn't listened to that episode.
Yeah. So predictive coding is when the brain updates the expected stimuli and uses contextual cues for your brain to process the exterior environment at a fast enough time. This is also tied to the free energy principle, which we also touched on another episode.
In the entropic brain episode.
Yes.
It all links together through the breath.
It does.
So I came across the same concept that you're discussing, and honestly, it's a little bit confusing. So my understanding of it was that this model also stemmed from a lot of studies that showed that just like how the respiratory rate coupled with activity of neurons in the locus coeruleus, the respiratory rate has been found to couple with neural oscillations, specifically in the gamma frequency range, which are high frequency oscillations. And these are thought to underlie more bottom-up signals in the context of predictive coding. So incoming stimuli, whereas alpha and beta, which are lower frequency waves, are thought to underlie the top-down signals.
Yeah.
And so what this theoretical model suggests is that by entraining gamma waves across the brain, respiration helps to encourage the flow of information from the bottom up. So specifically respiratory information of incoming air, right?
Mm-hmm.
So essentially through your volitional control of breath in the first place. Okay, actually, let me use an example. So it's known that by slowing down your breath, elongating exhales
Mm-hmm.
or slowing down your breath, you put yourself in a calmer state. And this is because of the physiological consequences that arise from it, such as decreased heart rate. And how I understood this neuronal model is that you can choose the interoceptive model that you want your mind to be in by altering the breath. So slowing down your breath or taking
Speeding
longer
up your
exhales, but let's use the same
Okay.
example for now, would put your state of mind, basically, it would force the interoceptive model to be that of a calm one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then speeding up your breath would do the opposite, and it would force an interoceptive model of that of an aroused one.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this way, you can consciously control your breath top down to put an emphasis on the bottom up signals, which is the incoming air, in order to create your top down interoceptive model that will shape your state of mind. So it's mind power, basically.
Yeah.
You can shape your state of mind through the simple act of changing your breathing rate
And controlling
your breath.
breathing.
Yeah. Okay, we got there in the end.
Yes. I have a question that I would like to pose. I'm not sure if this is too similar to the last question I posed, but can we think of other ways or mechanisms that show the relationship between brain and body interactions? I think breathing is such a perfect example of, like you said, like almost like mind over matter, controlling the breathing affects our physiology, as well as the fact that then it affects our the external inputs, and then that goes back up to top down. So it's like this cyclical thing, and this interaction between the exterior and the interior, and your volition versus things you can't control.
Yeah.
This is such a perfect gateway into like brain-body interactions.
Yes, for sure. And in response to that, the first thing that came to my mind was another brain-body interaction. I used to do a lot of dance, and I obviously still do a lot of yoga, both in pranayama, but also the physical side of it, of course. And I feel like the movement of your body is so intricately linked with your memory. So then the first thing I thought of was like muscle memory.
Yeah.
And how this influences, and not only influences, bidirectionally interacts with your mental state. And like the emotions you're feeling, if you're dancing or moving, it's sort of imprinted in the state of your body in that moment. And yeah, I guess, but that's a bit more complex because there's so many ways your body can move.
But it can also be a bit personal. We both
Definitely.
enjoy dance.
Yeah.
And so maybe someone who doesn't enjoy dance as much, but perhaps paints, that is also another example of like muscle memory, right?
Yeah.
So
any sort of movement.
yeah, okay, so the muscle memory could potentially be a mechanism that shows brain-body interactions.
Yeah, because movement of your body is another volitional thing. Actually, in the sense of predictive coding, some people have suggested that like any movement is actually just part of predictive coding to minimize the prediction error of your will of what state you want to be in that moment.
Okay, so like if I were to go grab a cup, in terms of predictive coding, what do you mean by that?
So you're creating a framework in your mind that you're going to grab a cup and you have to minimize the prediction error. So you're going to go physically grab the cup so that your movement fits your mental
intention.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I guess that's like a really rugged way sort of looking at predictive coding.
I was going to say one more thing. So I also read that, going back to movement, the connection between respiration and movement is utilized in the martial arts, where
Yes,
when you
yeah.
when you punch, this is synchronized with the expiration, and the tactic that they use is essentially the peak force has been correlated with, with the respiratory cycle.
Exhalation.
Yeah, exhalation.
Yeah, and I actually have so much to say about this. Because there has been a load of studies that showed that specific actions are linked with either inhalation or exhalation.
Mm-hmm.
Like even in terms of thought, a study showed that people were asked to come up with a quantity, like a number.
Yeah.
And they found that people who came up with this number during their inhales, the number was larger than an average than people who came up with it during their exhales.
Nice.
And there was another example of where a study found that the phase of breathing, so either inhalation or exhalation, enhanced fear discrimination and memory retrieval. So I don't remember exactly which way around it was, but I think it was that during inhalation, like, memory retrieval is better, and as well as fear discrimination. And a lot of, because during inhalation, it's known that it activates your sympathetic nervous system, whereas exhalation activates your parasympathetic nervous system. And these are part of the autonomic nervous system that are responsible for all of the consequent physiological effects, such as the heartbeat, as we've been talking about. We probably should have started with this. But what I find most important about all of this and interesting is that it is constantly in cycle. Yeah. Like, it's not that when we slow our breathing we're calmer, and when we speed up our breathing we're faster. Like, yes, but at a smaller scale, we're technically, every breath, every inhale and exhale, we're getting a bit more and a bit less stressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so yes, it definitely can be utilized in stuff like martial arts. Oh, I wanted to actually finish up with a really important point, which I feel I just have to mention. Now there are more studies being done in humans where they use EEG to record electrical activity across the brain, and then respiratory rate. But like, majority of studies have been done in mice. And I think something that we kind of ignore looking at the research is the fact that mice only breathe through their nose. Yeah. And a couple of papers have shown that all of these effects in terms of respiratory rhythm being coupled with gamma oscillations, they only occur in humans. Well, they only occur during nasal breathing, not during mouth breathing.
Yeah.
Oh, and I also came across this the other day as I was doing yoga, because in yoga you do a specific type of breathing, which is not actually through the nose. It's known as oceanic breathing, and it's when you create friction at the back of your throat. And then I was thinking, like, oh my gosh, it's not actually nasal breathing. Like, this is not enhancing my memory.
And it's the goal of that type of breathing is to keep the heat inside you, right?
Yes.
I just thought it would be good to explain.
Yes, it is, but it's also to create the sound so that it's easier to focus on your breath.
Okay.
Because if there's no sound there, it's much more difficult to keep reminding yourself of the breath. So, yeah. But yeah, this is something definitely to take into account, because there's obviously something unique about the fact that the air goes through the nose and acts on receptors in the nose.
Perhaps the olfactory
system, which is integrated with the limbic system in terms of neural circuitry, which is very connected to the memory system network. So, yeah.
Yeah, wow, it's good to point out the translation between my studies and human studies.
Yeah, exactly. And the significance of nose breathing. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up the episode. I hope you enjoyed listening a little bit to our thoughts and discussion on breathing, the brain, and being, which I just love saying.
Yes.
The BBB. And
not as you know it.
The BBB, not as you know it. Please spread that hashtag.
I know, it's the new definition of BBB.
Yeah.
Let's confuse all the new medics.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to check out our Twitter and Instagram at neuroverse_pod, and for more information, check out our website, neuroversepod.com. Thank you for all your support. We really appreciate it.